You're watching The Rita Panahi Show, and joining me now to give us the honest facts when it comes to all things energy and climate is best-selling author and president of the Centre for Industrial Progress, Alex Epstein. Alex, before we delve into Labor's electric car policy, I just learned that you have been blocked by the world's richest man on the platform that he now owns, Twitter. Explain to my audience, Alex, why Elon Musk has blocked you.
So this wasn't a recent thing at all. This happened many years ago. I wrote an article for Forbes talking about how the Model S was a good fossil fuel car. And I guess Elon and the Tesla people didn't like that. And so the response was to block me, which I found weird because I very rarely block people myself. Like my view is that they're harassing you or something like that. That's one thing. But if you're like an intellectual type, I think you should definitely be open to debate. And I love it when people they attempt to refute me on social media. So I thought it was pretty weak that he did that. It's within his rights for sure, but it's pretty intellectually weak when somebody challenges you to react that way.
Oh, see, I love the block button, so I can't blame Elon too much for that. But I hope he unblocks you, because I think you two are on the same page on a lot of issues, including nuclear energy, which we'll get to later. But first to Labor, they had their official campaign launch yesterday. Leader Anthony Albanese announced a plan to accelerate Australia's transition to electric cars by building a national network of charging stations and also investing $1 billion to turn minerals into batteries. Well, that's the plan anyway. Is this plan ultimately going to reduce costs for people running a vehicle, Alex?
Well, think about how gas stations came to be. People think that gasoline cars are just the one option we've had, but actually battery cars were around before gasoline cars, ethanol cars were around. What happened is gasoline cars won out on the market, including they built their own charging infrastructure, namely gas stations. And so I'm all for EVs building out their own infrastructure as it makes sense. But the problem is it's not cost effective for most people. And yet it's being forced on people, which means people are going to pay artificially high prices for often an inferior product. It's just very simple.
Now, Alex, there's a great deal of debate in Australia right now about whether Labor will again introduce a carbon tax if they're elected. They're talking about a levy or price, which pretty much amounts to the same thing. Tell my viewers why you believe a carbon price or a carbon tax is a terrible, terrible idea.
I think it's particularly terrible right now because what we have is we have an indictment of this whole net zero anti-carbon push. What that has led to is disastrous insecurity for Europe, disastrous increases in prices around the world. And so we should be reversing course. We should be liberating carbon, liberating nuclear, liberating everything. We shouldn't be going in this direction at all. So I don't know why certain people, at least in the US, certain people on the right are pursuing this carbon tax. And that's pretty foolish. Now, I understand maybe in Australia it's on the left. The other thing is carbon taxes, what they're trying to do is make us use less fossil fuel. But the world needs far more fossil fuel. That's the point of my books, The Moral Case for Fossil Fuels and Fossil Future. Basically, the world is massively deprived of energy. Most people have very little energy. 3 billion people use less electricity than one of our refrigerators. And so we need much more energy, and most of it needs to come from fossil fuels because nothing can scale that way, even as close to as well as fossil fuels for the foreseeable future. The other thing is it gives the government a license to have unlimited control over our lives, because if you control CO2, you control every machine that emits CO2, which basically means you can control every industry. So this is really a fascist idea that gives government a potentially unlimited license to control our lives.
Now, in Australia, we not only have the Labor Party and the Greens, which are both parties are really pushing fairly dramatic cuts to emissions, but we also have this new Climate Party also pushing radical green policies. And Alex, you've raised an interesting philosophical question about whether most of these greenies are actually pro or anti-human. Explain that to me.
Sure. So when you're talking, it's very important to think about what is your philosophy of our environment? What's your view about the relationship between humans and nature? And I find it very helpful to ask one basic question, which is your environmental philosophy that our goal should be to advance human flourishing on Earth, or should it be to eliminate human impact on Earth? And I think you can see with the modern climate movement, their obsession is just with eliminating our impact on climate at all costs. And notice they don't care at all about the fact that energy, specifically fossil fuels, make us far safer from climate. As I've mentioned on the show many times, the rate of climate related disaster death has gone down 98%, in large part because we have fossil fuels to deal with things like extreme heat, extreme cold, drought, flood, etc. So if you really cared about humans and with climate, you'd talk about climate livability. You wouldn't just be focused on let's eliminate our impact. And more broadly, you wouldn't be focused on let's be green, let's not impact the earth. You would say let's impact the earth a lot, but make it a much better place for human life. And the fact that we now live to 80 instead of 30 shows that our impact is overall really good.
And lastly, I've got to commend you for schooling a Hollywood star, Mark Ruffalo, about nuclear power. Let's first listen to what the Avengers star had to say.
The fact of the matter is, at the end of the day, nuclear is very expensive and it's very dangerous. And it might be, a transition for the moment. But at the end of the day, these other technologies, wind, water, sun, geothermal, they're much cheaper, they're much safer. And in the long run, they create many more jobs.
Alex, is he right? Is nuclear both expensive and dangerous and these other options much cheaper?
Well, it's a lot more expensive than it should be because people like Mark Ruffalo are promoting the false idea that it's dangerous. If you make something dangerous in people's minds, if you demonize it, what happens is the government treats it as a criminal activity and they pass an effectively unlimited amount of regulation. Say in Australia, you're not allowed to do it at all. That's total criminalization. But in the US, it used to take 4 years to make one of these things, a nuclear power plant. Now it's 16 and it can easily be canceled. So think about how expensive that makes it. So it's a self-fulfilling fallacy that nuclear is dangerous and expensive. If you recognize that nuclear is uniquely safe, then it can be cheap. And I believe ultimately it can be the cheapest source of energy in the decades and generations to come.
As for the affordability of the renewables mentioned there, I mean, is there any example in the world where they have actually lowered energy prices?
No, they haven't. What always happens is what I call partial cost accounting, which is really energy accounting fraud. So what they do is they take the solar panels and the wind turbines, they say, hey, these on their own seem pretty cheap, but they don't count the transmission lines and in particular the fossil fuel backup that's necessary to make these unreliables work. So when you look at the long-term trends in places like California, Germany, what happens is prices go up. And if you try to cut back on the fossil fuel backup, you have disasters like Texas. So these things are failures in practice. They're good for like if you have a remote home and you don't need much energy, you can put up solar panels. But there is no case of these things successfully powering an industrial society or anything close.
Alex Epstein, always a pleasure. Thank you for joining me tonight.
Thank you.